Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. So today I'm joined with Kim Curtis. How you doing today, Kim?
Good. Thank you, Kirk. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, glad to have you on the show. So we're going to be talking with Kim about a bunch of really important topics today. But before we begin, Kim, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, I'm the CEO of Wealth Legacy Institute, which is a registered investment advisory firm out of Denver, Colorado, specializing in pre-retirees, kind of saving for to living in, moving them through that transition.
Okay, so how did you get started down this path? What kind of drove you there? What was the impetus to do this?
Oh, Kirk, the abbreviated story. I actually have a legal background, and I ended up in finance by a quiz. I had a friend in human resource. My background, I have a legal background in negotiation, mediation, arbitration. And I no longer became a spokesperson. I became a spokesperson and no longer was doing settlement conferences. So this person put me through a bunch of series of assessments, and finance came up, financial planning came up, and I've been doing it for almost 30 years.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So mediation, arbitration, negotiation. That sounds interesting. So what did you like about that?
I loved it. I loved it. At the time, it was really trend setting in terms of alternative dispute resolution. The lawyers were just starting to get on board with it. So it was fun to be really young and be relatively the smartest person in the room. At least when you're in your 20s, you'll always think that. So, so, so that was really fun at the time. I think that the transition that I needed to take was really being in the heart of the matter versus someone meeting with realtors and bankers to put clauses in contracts. And so that was the transition. I made the mistake, however, going to a brokerage firm to get my feet wet. And one day I decided to read the back of a client statement in terms of the disclosures. And at the time, it was 8 pages, actually 4 pages, two to a page of tiny, tiny, tiny print. And I'll never forget as I was reading that and seeing all the fees and conflicts of interest that a tear came down my cheek with my legal background, right? You would think I would have read it earlier. Not only would you think I would understand that I was not a fiduciary at the time, but we all, in the nature of our work, act like we want to do our best work for the client. And so that was a big transition. And that was 16 years ago that I switched to create Wealth Legacy Institute.
Well, that's optimistic. All of us. I don't think I would say all of us feel that way. I might, but I don't think all of us, in quotes. There's a lot that don't.
Fair, fair. It's an industry in disruption. I mean, even 20 years ago, trying to be a profession, and yet each of these, and when I think of financial planning, it's these 6 key areas. Well, you have the lawyers, the insurance guys, the insurance professionals, the tax people, and then the investment side. So all of these different silos are trying to go into one profession as it relates to the certified financial planner designation. And I find that fascinating because it just only gets more diverse from what those original silos were.
So I want to, for a second, kind of go back to the alternate dispute
Yeah,
resolution
sure.
part, because to me, that's been a fascinating trend that's been kind of coming for a while. And it seems like, to me, the legal field makes a lot of money for getting people all whipped up into a frenzy when, there's alternative ways to do it. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that plays into kind of where we're going with the conversation.
Happy to. When you think of conflict and disputes in our country, it's a very litigious society um, because we have a lot of lawyers out there, unlike other countries. And so when we think about how we deliver services, to be able to have an alternative to resolve a situation quickly, whether it's in your marriage, whether it's your employer, or whether it's a larger perspective, whether it's a construction agreement or otherwise. So having contracts historically have allowed for a quicker resolution of a dispute that more likely is a better outcome. In mediation, there's no one that decides your outcome. It's the two of you with the help of a mediator facilitator that actually helps you bridge to get to a common agreement. And I think that is the most beautiful way to do it if both parties or all parties are interested in a win-win-win. If it's win-lose, it's not an effective forum. Arbitration is where you have arbiters, whether it's one or three. You give your case, they give their case, and they decide the outcome, and that outcome is final. There's no higher authority to determine whether you can keep going. And that in itself is like, done, let's move on with our lives. And it's particularly useful in a marriage resolution. I did not do that. That was not my area of expertise. I was more in the business side.
Okay.
But using that as a financial planner, what do people argue about the most, Kirk, right? In couples, money. Well, there may be another topic, but
there's other topics. Money's one of them.
We won't talk. I saw that face of yours. We won't talk about that topic, but generally it's money. And so if you can have a couple in the room, especially transitioning into retirement, because if there was a wealth earner or earner and someone that stayed at home, they have to reinvent themselves and actually go through some different types of things to be what is their next. And that takes a lot of work. Then oftentimes they may be on different pages of what they think that retirement will look like. And I think with my background, to be able to hold that container for them to actually have the conversation with each other. And it may be the first time that they're actually telling the truth about what they really want. And bridging that for them, not as a therapist, that's the last thing, but as asking the difficult questions to get outcomes that are better for both.
So how do you go about that? Because I like where you're going with this. This is how we approach it too, is what I call the emotional side of money. It's not just about dollars and cents. But how do you go about kind of facilitating those conversations and getting people to kind of bridge that gap, which is mostly of their own making?
Kirk, it's never about the money. It's never about the money. So when couples come in with disparate ideas of what retirement may look like, it's really the idea of what we have a bunch of tools that helps them clarify what that looks like. And in my book, Retirement Secrets, Keys to Retiring Happy, Healthy, and Free, there are tons of exercises in there for couples to walk through individually and then collectively, so that at least they know where they're together and where they're apart. And those tools help us then, when they're in the room, get a little further in the conversation. We had a couple that she stayed at home and he was retiring and wanted to buy a big RV and travel the world, or not the world, travel the US for a couple of years to find out their ideal retirement place. She, on the other hand, that was the last thing on her mind. She wanted to stay where she lived. She had family and people and her friends all around her. Because he worked and traveled internationally all the time, he really didn't have any friends in that community. And so to bridge that conversation, first we had to get her to actually share what she really wanted. Because oftentimes, we don't really know what we want until someone kind of brings it out. She knew she didn't want the RV, but she didn't quite know what. And the outcome ultimately was that they would look for a retirement community, which ended up being in Tennessee. And then the RV would be second. And not to travel to find their retirement destination. They found a place in Tennessee on a lake, but then they could travel differently. And she was more engaged in that because she knew she was coming back to a nest, which was her place in Tennessee.
Nice. Well, I can assure you my wife doesn't want an RV either. During COVID.
And you do?
Well,
Kirk?
No, actually during COVID, 1 week into the lockdown, we decided that it is not going away. It was pretty apparent to me. So we ended up looking at options. And one of them was traveling internationally to get out of the country. But we were afraid we'd get locked out, which ended up happening. Then we went down, we were exploring RV because you could travel around the country. You could go to places that were maybe not as strict. I'm in the Northeast. So I was like, hey, when we get an RV, we can travel around. There's nothing to do. There's nowhere to be. The kids don't have to be anywhere. It's perfect. And she's like, I don't want to live in an RV. We ended up renting a beach house for like 3 months, which was phenomenal, and especially for the kids. But the point was, it was like a unique time in our lives where we could have done whatever we wanted, and we were exploring ideas. And it was like, well, all right, you don't want to do an RV. I'm not an RV guy. I just thought it was like the only way to see the country if you're going to travel around in COVID.
Right. Right. Well, I kind of fell into that trap too. It wasn't the RV, it was an adventure sprinter van.
Oh yes, people love
So
those.
living in Colorado, it's a lot easier to have an adventure sprinter van. And with all the BLM, Bureau of Land Management land in Utah and Colorado and Montana and Wyoming, I mean, it was actually, and still is, really fantastic. So we did do it was right before COVID happened that we actually made that purchase and are loving it ever since.
Nice. That's awesome. Well, I'm glad that was the BLM you were talking about. I was wondering where that story was going. uh, so, but yeah, so getting back to like, retirement here.
Mhm.
So, you know, I think the question that kind of frequently comes up is, as you're kind of alluding to, is like, what does retirement really mean? So, how do you help bridge that gap for people when, when they're thinking of one thing and they're talking one way, and yet over here, that they really mean is this, but they can't see that bridge. So, like, how do you help bridge that from as a professional?
Yeah, I think it's asking questions more around meaning and purpose. And, because again, we talked about kind of reimagining what's your next for the next 30 years. And for many, it's the first time that they ever had an opportunity to actually think that big. I mean, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what was the bottom was food, clothing, shelter, and at the top was self actualization. Well, if you had a pyramid as it relates to our work, the first on the bottom is managing money. That's why people come to us. And then one up is financial planning, it's goal achievement. And you need both to be able to get to that next rung of that 4 rung pyramid, and that's lifestyle. So managing money with a financial plan allows you to get to lifestyle for them. And when they see that they can do it, all of a sudden they have peace of mind. And when they have peace of mind and cleared their heads, they can look at the pinnacle of that, and that's impact. Think about that. All your life, many of them feel like they're on a hamster wheel, making money, making money, making money, saving, 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 saving. They finally realize, wow, I could step off. What does that look like for the first time to actually ask those questions and to recognize that money is frenetic? And if we could put it down as a support foundation, all of a sudden it's not in their space anymore. So it really does allow them that peace of mind to think, what is that greater good? What is that I want to do in this last part of my life, individually and as a couple? And the more you focus around meaning and purpose and impact and family and legacy, the clarity unfolds because they start to get excited that they could actually think that without being disappointed. And oftentimes that's the first time.
Interesting. So I would imagine that in couples, at least in my experience, there's usually one that's more involved with the money and one that's less involved, and having those conversations. And I guess my point is people typically think differently in a marriage. It's rarely I've seen people run the same page. They're usually on opposite sides of the page. One's conservative, one's aggressive, one's a spender, one's a saver, like that sort of split. So how do you kind of bridge that in retirement when people are naturally thinking like, I want to travel in retirement? The other one's thinking, I just want to garden all day. I don't want to travel. Like, how do you deal with that?
You actually, Kirk, hit the nail on the head because oftentimes when they come to a firm like ours, that it's the first time that they've had that conversation and that they're on the same page, meaning that the spouse is engaged and they're making joint decisions. So that in itself is one of the benefits of working with a firm. So you got them all in one. They are on the same page, at least money wise, and she or he is finally engaged. To answer your question, I guess I'll tell a client story. Um, he retired as a lawyer and he loved antique cars, like nice cars, vintage Porsches, and he loved to go to these shows. It's the last thing she wanted to do. Like to hang out all day talking with other people, mostly guys, about their cars. Like she was not into it. And so, and when they traveled, she loved to do the city, like go out. And he didn't like to hustle and bustle around in cities for travel. And then when she would go visit her friends, he would like, where are you going? Where are you going? So when they weren't at a car show, he was like kind of up in her business because he didn't have anything else. It's like, when are you coming back? Are you making lunch? And she's like, no, 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 but I'm going to go see family. You want to come? No, I don't want to see our daughter. um, and so as we kind of brought all of that out of what that reality is for both of them, what they agreed to is that she would go to the car shows with him, but she would go out and do her different things and would only be there for a couple hours. That's what she committed. I'll be there for a couple hours. I'll meet some of your friends, and then I am going to do my travel things. And that she would only do one a month with him. And he got engaged because he developed a community that he didn't have before as a lawyer. So he ended up having all these friends all around the country. And she was able to continue to do with what she wanted to do without feeling like she was entertaining him.
That's great. I love that story. I think that's, one of the big challenges is the difference of goals and helping people feel. I guess in my experience, there's usually one person in the couple that's a little more shy and unwilling to maybe express their thoughts, and they just kind of go along with it, even though they have their own dreams.
Mm.
Um,
That's so
so
true.
do you see that a lot, like where people are kind of unwilling to express? They're just like, oh, I just do whatever he does or whatever she does, and
In the beginning, yes. I feel like that's part of our job, to bring voice to that person that feels like they don't have one. What we see more often is one is healthier and they have more of an active lifestyle, like surfing, beach, windsurfing, and the other is not at all. Like would rather just sit on the beach, and you can only do that for so long. So bridging the activity level is really important. And then if they are relocating, we have a relocation checklist to find out if you want to live in a different place, is making sure we assess the activity level of each so that if it is kind of disparate, where they find a place to end up allows for both of them to be at that activity level that's important to them. We also
interesting.
talk about relationship circles as, again, transitioning from saving to living in, especially during the pandemic. A lot of people that are single were lonely and isolated. And so one of the things we did first quarter is really identify the relationships in your life, and we call it relationship circles. And so you're in the center, and that first ring around you is intimacy. Like those are your friends or family that know all of your secrets. And outside of that is friendship. Friendship is like who you go to dinner with and the movies. And then that third circle is participation. And that's like maybe you go to church together, or you go to the gym together. And then lastly is exchange. That outside circle is your professionals. Once you identify the people in each of those circles, you then can see, oh my gosh, I have like one person in my intimacy circle. I have two or whatever in my friendship circle. And I don't have really anyone in participation. And most of the people I think are valuable to me is in exchange. How do I bring them in exchange to participation, or move people through to get closer to you, the center? And I'll tell you, Kirk, it's so eye opening when you actually do this and when you actually see the differences in the couple. Like how many couples have couples friends? And so that was a huge exercise. Clients really appreciated kind of walking through that exercise of working out to get a better idea of what they may need to do moving forward to have a more engaging retirement. Because remember, when you think of the four things that you need to do when you transition, the first is, you need to find meaning and purpose. The second is you need to stay healthy and active. Your new job is health, fitness, of course, managing money. But that last one is actually, believe it or not, the most engaged, the most important, and that is to stay engaged, to have a community around you. And studies reveal that those who have a community fare better in retirement than others.
Yeah, I've seen that with the blue zones. They talk a lot about how
Yeah,
the
yeah.
social part is a big piece. Although I somewhat I somewhat wonder about the blue zones. I think there's maybe something in the water because there's the whatever 6 or 7 different blue zones in the world, and they all have similar things, but there's still a lot of differences, right? And so I find that stuff fascinating
Mhm.
personally, but it's yeah, the social part is definitely a big piece of it. So appreciate you
There's a
sharing that.
part of me that wonders if it's data, like not not actually revealing the true data that they're not really living to 102 years old. They just and they're still getting some kind of pension of some sort, welfare in some way.
They're scamming the social security system. They're weekend at Bernie's. Oh look, Bernie's still alive. He's having a good time. See the picture?
He's frozen in the freezer. Oh wait, you're coming to visit our house? Let's thaw him out.
Yeah, Bernie's doing great. He's awesome. He's healthy. He's 120. He's doing great.
And hope science catches up with you.
Yes, at
Oh.
some point they'll be able to unfreeze Ted Williams' head. So
That's right. Oh.
I think there's a lot of Futurama episodes about that, but anyway. So well, good. So one of the other topics I want to delve into too, because I know retirement, that's an awesome one. I love talking about that. But a part of that is also as we age, is helping our own aging parents.
Mm, mm.
So how do you kind of talk through that and bring that through the conversation? Because to me, that's one of the most difficult conversations you can have.
Ooh, so Kirk, it's so funny that you mentioned that because many of our people, our listeners, are dealing with aging parents and also maybe even children in college or younger. So they end up being in the middle. Um, I actually lost my mom last year in January, and my older sister and I, even me in the business, missed some really signature pieces around that. Not so much the money side of it, but it was more the emotional and recognizing the care that someone needs. So having that conversation with your clients, and we call it humanographics. It's humanity on a graph, and we plot family structure and tree, like a family tree, and then ask questions around it, up and down, around family. So we could get a sense of whether they're, well, we know whether their parents are alive, grandparents, we know where they came from. We talk about health a little bit, and you can see patterns, um, and addiction issues also may come through. So when I think of one of the things that my sister and I, because remember, sometimes your parents, no one lives near them. And in this particular case, my sister did live nearby, but then she moved. And yet she knew all the relationships that my mom had. So we put together an emergency information sheet that listed, so that as practitioners, that is something that we could help our clients with. And we, you know what, we have an aging parents checklist that we could give away for free to the listeners, um, that I think is like 19 pages of things to think about. One thing that we did is, my mom loved music, and we created a playlist of her favorite songs. So when she could no longer speak, she could hear her music. And that was something that I thought was big for us, to kind of feel like she's getting. And of course, for her, many of them were like spiritual church songs. So that was really helpful for her. Um, so that was just something that was really simple, but helped. The emergency information sheet we had on the refrigerator. So when we recognized that we had to have caregivers come in, they all had access to who's the family that lives relatively nearby. Here's when she gets her hair done. Here's when she goes to church. Here's the people that's important to her. And so we were able to create that community through that sheet.
Nice. Yeah, I think it sounds like you put a lot of thought into this, and it's such a challenging part of people's lives. And one thing I've seen certainly is that when we have clients and then they have aging parents, many of them turn into the caregiver themselves.
Oh, Yes.
which of course creates a whole nother problem that people don't expect or think about until much later. So how do you address that with people?
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, honestly, it really starts with the conversation up front. I think as adult children, we're afraid to have a money conversation with our aging parents about what are their resources to have additional care. And what is their game plan? So if you could have that difficult conversation, and in this guide, we actually have like how to ask those questions to at least see where are they. So how much will you have to come forward, or do they relatively have it set in a way that you could actually provide caregivers to them, some relief. And the key around that is if it's family members, you have to have the conversation with your siblings on if you're the one stuck because you're the one nearby, what are the siblings going to do to contribute? And how do you get care days where like you're out of there and the siblings coming in while you go take 2 weeks off, and rotating that so that everyone feels they're engaged, whether it's through money and also visit, but then they're on the same page as to the decline of your parent or someone you love. Because oftentimes, if you're the one with boots on the ground, everyone else is telling you what to do because they have no clue the decline of the parent until they get there and recognize, oh, this is a lot worse than I thought.
Yeah, I think it's such a complex web of challenges there, like what you're talking about. So, obviously one of the challenges that comes into play, especially as a generational challenge,
Mhm.
is, older parents that don't want to share their financials with their kids. I see this a lot. And that generation, the boomers are maybe a little bit more willing, but the prior generation are
Mhm.
completely unwilling. It's all a secret, and we don't talk about money. That's just not something we talk about. Like, okay, well, we don't talk about anything. So what are we going to talk about?
Kirk, I
So,
think the piece around that is they don't want to leave you with a mess. They may not want to talk about it, but they don't want to leave you with chaos. And so if you approach the conversation that we're already going to be sad when you're gone, and and dealing with different issues, but if you could help us by making it easier and not be a burden, then
yeah.
I mean, saying it in the appropriate words, they don't want to be a burden. And so if you could bridge that to make sure that certain things, like get rid of that safe deposit box, just empty it, turn it in, get rid of it. That is one of the things that's really hard at the end of a parent's life, to get into the bank to get that. Put your name on the bank accounts, if there's a few of you, or have an agreement, a family meeting, and deciding even with the siblings, okay, you, Bobby, are in charge of finances. We all agree. Okay, you're in charge of healthcare to make that just, and we all agree that whatever that person decides, we're all going to be in agreement in terms of a living will or pulling the plug or whatever that is. We're not going to second guess you. So even if you don't have the parent, if the siblings can get all on the same page beforehand, because in my situation, my mom was the matriarch, just like my grandmother was and my great grandmother was. The women were the matriarchs of the family. And they were the ones that could call a meeting, and all the siblings and cousins and nieces and nephews would show up. When they're no longer here, no one has the authority to call a meeting to get everyone together to show up. And so there has to be some kind of transfer of that elder to the next gen, so the next gen can carry on the community of an extended family.
Yeah, I've noticed that too when the matriarch or patriarch passes or becomes incapacitated in some way. Many families just kind of fall apart because they're the glue, right? The
Become
glue
dysfunctional.
disappears.
Yes.
Um,
And fractured,
yeah,
oftentimes fractured.
yep. And it happens in the States a lot too. I can't remember an
Mhm.
estate. Maybe one time in my whole career has an estate not been contentious in one way, shape, or form. It's just so
Oh,
common.
that's terrible.
Sometimes it's a random relative that has nothing to do with the estate that comes in and starts like making a mess. Well, I need money too, and it's just
Mhm.
people just get weird about it. It's I The way I characterize it is it's undirected. I know I'm drawing a blank on the
Grief
wording today.
processing.
Yes, it's undirected grief. It's a grief process
Mhm.
that they don't understand, and they just direct their anger and grief towards other people. And
Mhm.
it just destroys, families. So how do you deal with that part? Because that's so common.
I'll call a family meeting, bring all the stakeholders to the conference room table, air the grievances. That's my mediation skills, air their grievances, so that everyone feels like they've been heard. Many of them feel like the black sheep and that their voice isn't being heard. So you put them all in a room. You have shared agreements up front, and you talk about, and then what's your best outcome, meet individually and then together, is, I think, the best way to bridge a family that's falling apart.
So you're basically having Festivus for family members, the airing of grievances.
Well, you have to have clear agreements up front. If you don't have those clear agreements that everyone buys into, it
Yeah.
becomes very difficult.
Yeah, totally agree. That was a Seinfeld reference for all those who didn't understand. Anyway, Kim, I really appreciate you coming to the show. What are some final thoughts you can leave us with as we kind of end the conversation here?
It's so interesting, because the chaos and the disruption that we've had as it relates to the capital markets, and we spent this whole time talking about the other side of money. And I think I will end with that there's no amount of rate of return that could create an extraordinary life. And we just ended up talking about a lot of those different issues that help navigate into an extraordinary life. So that was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us, Kim, and sharing your wisdom. I love your perspective. I think you and I share a similar perspective here in a lot of ways, where most people just focus on the numbers, and I think focusing on the emotional side of money, as I call it, is so much more important, because that's what gives the quality of life. As you said, no amount of money can give you that, and I 100% agree. So I appreciate you sharing. So where can people find more about you, Kim?
Yeah, well, we talked about the Aging Parents Checklist guide, the free guide that we're going to offer. And there's also 10 laws of money that every investor should know. And those free resources are at financialliteracypress.com. Financialliteracypress.com. There may, Kirk, also even be a free workbook, Retirement Secrets workbook, that is companion to the book itself. And if that's on Financial Literacy Press, that is like 92 plus pages that you could write stuff out on some of these questionnaires that we talked about for couples or individuals to navigate, to help them find meaning and purpose, and to know what they need to do around healthy action and money and staying engaged with community.
Awesome. Well, Kim, I really appreciate you joining us on the show, and look forward to having you back in the future.
Thank you, Kirk. Appreciate your time.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist, because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room, as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room. All right. Well, that was a great interview with Kim. Really appreciate her coming on the show and sharing her wealth of wisdom with us. Now we're into the panel portion of the show. We have our very own Megan Gorman. Hey, Megan.
Hey, Kirk. How you doing today?
Doing great. Doing great. Glad to have you. And we also have our very own Doug Heagren. Hey, Doug.
Good morning, Kirk. Long time no see.
Yeah. So let's dive right in. So, Megan, what were some of your takeaways from the interview?
First of all, I got a kick out of the fact that Kim is also an attorney, right? And I think that I just think as a side note, it brings up a great point that as a career path, finance, and in particular financial counseling, is something that is really, really something that people who with that skill set are really well set up to do. Because I think, and I know this is true with both of your practices, I think a lot of what we do, and Kim talked about it a bit, is we really help people do some of the hard work they're unable to do themselves emotionally about money. I know, Kirk, you didn't want to delve into the other thing that people fight about, but money is one of those things. And I think that a lot of times, if we do our jobs right, we are a therapist in a lot of ways to work through issues. And I really liked Kim's example of the husband and wife, and he was retiring and he wanted to take an RV to figure out where they were going to go live. And, the wife was like, not interested. And I do see that happen from time to time in my practice, where one spouse is not as open about sharing about what they want, right? But the other spouse sort of is driving the ship or the RV and what they want. And so it's really, really important when you're working with an advisor to be open and share what you're looking for, because like being in a therapist's office, working with an advisor is often a safe space, because the advisor is trained to make sure that we de-escalate. And I think all of us have been in those situations where we've had to help a couple through, but we keep the tone and tenor from becoming a big fight.
Yeah, no, that's great, Megan. And Doug, what about you? What are some of your takeaways?
Well, as I mentioned to you on offline, Kirk, I actually have met Kim Curtis, know her from when I started back in Denver in practice. She actually, I figured out where she is. Formerly was an advisor with American Express Financial Advisors up until 2007. So we crossed paths there. And so I know where she's getting where she got a lot of her basis and foundation of her concepts. And back in the day, it was interesting. I remember one of the things that Ameriprise did as a promotion, which I thought was pretty interesting, was this very uncomfortable but yet very expensive chair that they would put in the front office. And the chair was a lot of people would ask about that chair, and it was just surprisingly much more expensive than it looked. But the reason it was there was to provoke the conversation of the anti-rocking chair, okay? Because retirement had changed, right? It used to be when people they worked up until retirement. I think once people retired, I mean, a lot of people passed away within 10 years of retirement, right? It was it. I mean, the work was everything. It was their life. Nowadays, there is so much more time. If you can have the pleasure of having done the right things up front, right? And it takes the work to do that, right? We are constantly battling those insatiable wants of today against preparing for those future needs of what you want. But when you put that into perspective and you begin to think about that earlier, it changes the way we think about money. One of the things that we did back then is we had something called the Dream Book, which was something where as new couples, we would sit down. I still use concepts of this today. Sit down and it walked through a number of questions that had nothing to do with finance. It had to do with understanding what really mattered to people. And that's where it comes down to, this cross between what we can control and what matters. And unfortunately, not enough people, especially couples, have conversations around truly what matters to them. We talk about money and financial, our industry is notoriously poor at this. We sit there and we talk so analytically about the numbers. And yes, money matters, but as she talks about, it's on the very basic level, right? What it comes down to is what's important versus what's necessary. It's necessary to save. But at the end of the day, I don't know about you know, the two of you, but when I'm on my deathbed, when they say, gosh, when you look back on your life, what is it that you are most proud of? I'm not going to say putting money in my Roth. Okay. It's necessary. What was important is why we have that money. And so, and that's the part I think people don't spend enough focus on, is what really matters. What is important? What is the true concept of it? Because once you understand what matters and what you're trying to do, then you can truly go into it with the right mindscape, which also is a transition here, because another thing that was a really powerful study that I'm a firm believer in is Ken Dykewald did something. He's updated it. You can find this out and find more about through agewave.com, but it's the new retirement mindscape study. All of the people that were transitioning, the 78 million boomers that began to turn 60 and as of January 2006, okay, there is 5 stages of retirement that people will go in when they leave. It morphs over kind of similarly to the 5 stages of grief. Okay. And that goes into that new kind of anti-rocking chair, because that's the time in which you will find a lot more about yourself. But if you're not having those conversations earlier, it can be a very jarring transition into that next stage of life.
Yeah, that's great. Those are great resources, and we'll put those in the show notes for the listeners here. So Megan, how do you have conversations with clients about what really matters? I imagine you have a lot of clients that are wealthy and can retire a lot earlier than others. So these conversation about like what really matters in retirement is probably a big deal. So how do you have those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, look, I had a conversation this week with clients. Obviously, people are stressed right now, given the current economic situation, right? And I think there's this misconception that just because you have high income, you know, versus the, you know, and large asset base, that life becomes simple, right? So some of the things that we were working through together is the original thesis that they asked me to run some analytics for is, if she ended up working just another year and took severance, could they retire? And the short answer was yes. But the caveat was that they would have to be able to live on $350,000 a year net. Now, I know people are hearing that and thinking, oh my God, well, that's a ton of money. But one thing, you know, keep in mind is more money, more problems, right? So more assets to service, more houses. Oftentimes they're supporting other family members. And so what we got into a bigger question was, if she worked a couple more years, they could probably live on the living expenses that they want to live on, which is closer to $500,000 a year net, right? But at the end of the day, is it worth that for the quality of life, right? Because a lot of these very high-paying jobs are incredibly stressful on the body, right? There's a reason they give out executive physicals to executives. So it's one of those things where, one, in hearing these numbers, going in with a very open mind and really understanding that, yes, at that income level, it's okay to want to be able to spend more. It's okay that that might be what's more important to them, because as they ticked through the things that mattered to them, it was the ability to fund grandchildren's education. It was the ability to take the whole family on very big trips. It was the ability that they wanted to have the money set so that if in the event one of them got, you know, an illness early on, they would be able to stay and age in their home and bring in care. So it's all of those different things that to them was, to Doug's point, it might not seem necessary, but it was important to them to have a high quality of life. And so I think, you know, hearing all these things, the biggest thing I often just see people struggle with is being open and honest about what they spend. And I think that both of you deal with that too with clients. And so that also factors into the important versus necessary conversation.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, talking about having these open conversations when, you know, when it's such a hard topic to talk about to begin with. It's not taboo in a relationship, but it's definitely kind of a weird topic that people don't want to talk about. But, you know, let's talk about aging parents, because I think, you know, especially, you know, the three of us were Gen X, and, you know, we have, this is kind of next on the list for us, is dealing with aging parents.
Next, I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah, well, I know, me too. but I think it brings up the concept. Like, there's a lot of issues that come up here. So, yeah. So Megan, as a follow-up, what's, how do you deal with these aging parent issues? Like, how are you having these conversations? Because no one wants to talk about it. And most people don't even understand the complexity that they're going to have to deal with aging parents.
I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of nuance in it, right? So I'll bring up a couple of issues that I've been dealing with in navigating my mother's healthcare, which is, first of all, sibling dynamics, and then daughters versus sons, right? So, sibling relationships are often the best relationships we ever have. They are our peers. They're the only people who can call us out on stuff that others can't. But sibling dynamics play a part in how this works when you have a sick parent. And I think it's really important to talk to not just your parent, but your siblings about what role do we each want to play in caring for our parents. So in my situation, my youngest brother is the one with the kids. He brings to the situation the ability for my parents to see their grandchildren. And that's something I just can't deliver on, right? But my other brother and I, my other brother is on the ground. He's closer to my mother. He can go spend the night there and spend time with her. And I'm the one doing all of the coordinating the doctors, the Medicare coverage, the out-of-pocket coverage, the bill pay. And so what's been really important is in navigating this is making sure everybody knows their roles in working with siblings. And it sounds easy, but you have to remember, when we work with our siblings at times or things with our parents, we all revert back to who we were when we were children living in the house. So that's the first thing with this. The second thing is daughters versus sons. And I highly recommend anyone focusing on this to look at Cameron Huddleston's both website and book on this. But I will say, as a daughter in dealing with my mom, there are things she is willing to tell me and have me do that she just wouldn't have asked my brothers. Right? It just isn't the right, it isn't just the right tone and tenor. And I am sure with my father, the roles will reverse in that. And so I think the thing is, really think about who you are in the family, think about the conversations you can have and the conversations you can't have, and work with your siblings to get this done. And the last thing I'll say in navigating my mother's healthcare is, I come from a corporate background. I work in PowerPoint all day long. I actually have a PowerPoint of my mother's care plan. And I use it to be a tombstone document. I mean, it's a bad word to use for it, but it is the core document whenever we bring a new provider into the relationship. So whether it's, companion care, whether it's, I have a house call doctor I found that is covered by Medicare, whether it's other care for PT, OT, right, that you need to have when you have aging parents. Having one document that lays out every doctor they see, their regular appointments, the meds they take, all of the key contacts, what's covered by Medicare, what's not, is very, very valuable. So I highly suggest anyone who is going through this to try to have such a document. Because when I first got into the mix, I kept asking my brothers, do we have a centralized one pager of all the info? And the answer I kept finding was no.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that insight, Megan. What about you, Doug?
But I'd love to hear Doug's point of view on this.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Doug?
Well, one thing I thought was interesting, and I think this is something that's really important for anybody listening to understand, is that the gender role in caring for aging parents, and as you said, kind of talking about your relationship with your mom, and what it may be with your father. There's actually there's a pretty decent site out there, agingcare.com, and they talk about this, that there's going to be, the number of people over the age of 65 will double to 95 million by 2060. That's a lot of people that are going to need care. And that means an increase in the prevalence of chronic conditions like Alzheimer's, long-term care. As when they start looking at the difference between male and female caregivers, women by default are often more the primary caregiver, 67% to 59%. Meaning that they're the sole caregiver or provide the majority of care. And the primary caregiver is likely going to have a higher level of intensity of care. I saw this with my wife's grandmother as she was going through the last stages of aging process. It was her one aunt that ended up being the moving in and ending up being the primary caregiver to her. The person that gives the primary level of care is 44% compared to 33%. But there's a lot of things that come into it. There's family composition that has a lot of directly impact. But one thing that the American Sociological Association found is the amount of care that daughters provide to aging parents is primarily affected by constraints they face, such as jobs or childcare. But the amount of caregiving that sons contribute is associated only with the presence or absence of other care team members, such as sisters or a parent's spouse. So I think that one of the things that's really important, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of socioeconomic factors that I think are probably changing. But I do think that when you're talking to families, and it is really important to understand and have that dynamic and conversation around aging parents, especially with your female clients, because it does, whether it's they emotionally they feel that they are that they just want to, that it is their responsibility to take care of the parent, or whether or not it by default ends up falling onto them more often than not. I think this is a really important touch point, especially for individuals out there, especially advisors that might be listening to it. Historically, the things are changing, but there has been a history in the past of a lot of conversation. A lot of advisors are still very bad at this. They'll talk, and they'll stand up talking to the guy in the room, right? And they kind of ignore the needs of the other spouse. And while I said that thing is changing, I think when it comes to the care, elder care, this is a really, really critical topic that not only should, that needs to be discussed from an advisor-client relationship to understand what your parent clients are going through, but as a family, when you're sitting down looking at what that's going to mean to your own retirement, I mean, you're going to be on the early cusp of aging, but you might have, maybe someone who's retiring at 65 has got 85 or 90-year-old parents. It becomes one of the major jobs that may end up impacting that the amount of time and quality of life that they may be able to have going into their retirement. And if you're a couple and you're working on this, right, and you're saying, well, we're going to have all this time left, but one of you is focused on maybe now worried about the worry of aging care, that's going to create not only a lack of time and focus on the things that are, that you want to do, because that becomes a very important part of what matters to you is take care of those parents, but it also can create stress between you, because obviously if you're going to spend, an average of it's generally an average about 4 years that someone is in some sort of long-term custodial care situation, and you're going to be spending those 4 critical years during your retirement. What does that do to the relationship you have? And those stressors can lead to other things. We're talking about great, there's a massive boom, unfortunately, right now of what they call gray divorce, right? Of retirees that get to this point of retirement and they don't have those connections anymore that really, maybe it was the kids that kept them together. Now they're retired and they don't find that they have those connections, and aging care, along with not necessarily having the planning and discussion and communication years before, lead to, unfortunately, a void there, a gap there that can exacerbate issues and lead to tension that could lead to bigger problems. I think it's a huge conversation to have, and it's a really important conversation to have earlier. And the more that families are having those conversations earlier with it when they're younger, the better that can translate to the type of planning that needs to happen in terms of making sure all of those involved are taken care of.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Thanks for that, Doug. So we're going to wrap it up here. So Megan, final thoughts from you, and where can people find more about you?
Yeah, I think when you think about engaging a financial planner or financial counselor, really think about it as trying to also explore the emotional journey you have with money. And if you're married, it's also about making your marriage much better. I will tell you, I think I have a better marriage because we talk about money all the time. And I think that's true of a lot of clients that I see. So you can find me at Forbes.com/Megan Gorman. Kirk, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on, Megan. Doug, final thoughts. Where can people find more about you?
Well, I think the biggest thing, again, from a planning standpoint, especially what we're working on, is have those conversations. There is a correlation between a strong relationship and finance. And again, and it's not just now, but years into the future, understanding what is it? What are those connections? What's that tribe? What's that community? When you're not working every day, what are you going to do? What do you still, the old saying, be friends first. And I think, one of the biggest things that exacerbates that issue, and you talk, and of course, Kim talked about it, the person that worked all the time, and now they're not going to work anymore. They're not traveling all the time, but they don't have those connections, those circles. And so I think I think it's important, especially if you are a business owner, that it is important for you to take time to understand the balance of why you're doing what you're doing. What is it that you're working for? What are you creating? Is it about the business, or is it about creating a better life for you? And so I think that's really important. If you haven't taken the time as a business owner to figure out how to make that business, to begin to understand the balance of work and life today, start working on that now. And a great way to do that is to go to automaticbusinessmethod.com and download the 9-step checklist, the free checklist that you can download today to begin to build a business that's going to work without you. So, and if the business can thrive without you, I mean, you hear the stories of people that now have built this efficiently, and they're working only a couple hours a week on their business. What does that free you up to do with the rest of your life? To rebuild those connections with your family, with your children, with your spouse. See it all the time. Families where an individual has worked for 40 years and now they retire and they don't know their kids, or they missed all those moments. Work on those things now. Download that 9-step checklist to begin to build that business that you will allow you to thrive in your life today. automaticbusinessmethod.com.
Great. Thanks for coming on, Doug. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.